The file on Marilyn Monroe's death looks straightforward at first glance. A famous actress found in a locked bedroom. Empty pill bottles on the nightstand. A coroner's report citing acute barbiturate poisoning. An inquest that calls it a probable suicide. Case closed. But when investigators looked more closely at the documents, the timelines, and the medical findings, the picture became less tidy. The levels of drugs in her system didn't match the condition of her stomach. Key tissue samples were never tested. Witness statements shifted over time. And around the edges of the file lingered some of the most powerful men in America. Tonight we open File 6-21, Marilyn Monroe, Death of a Goddess. The last summer, August 1962, Marilyn Monroe is 36 years old. On paper, she's still one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. In reality, her career is unsteady, her private life is fragile, and her doctors are worried. For years she has lived with depression, insomnia, and a dependence on sedatives. She has already survived several overdoses. Her world is crowded with competing influences. Studio executives, psychiatrists, acting coaches, ex-husbands, and a circle of political and underworld figures. She's been linked romantically to the President of the United States and his brother, the Attorney General. She vacations at a Nevada lodge part-owned by a Chicago mob boss and frequented by entertainers and politicians alike. In early August, Monroe spends the weekend at her small Spanish-style house on Fifth Helena Drive in Brentwood. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, stays overnight at the request of her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. Monroe speaks by phone with friends and colleagues. One of them, actor Peter Lawford, later recalls a final call where she sounded heavily sedated and ended the conversation with what he took as a goodbye. Sometime that night, Monroe dies. At about 3:30 a.m., although in her initial statement she claimed it was closer to midnight, Murray notices light under the bedroom door, gets no response, and eventually calls Greenson. He arrives, breaks a window, and finds Monroe lying face down on the bed, nude, a telephone receiver in her hand. A second doctor is called. Only at 4:25 a.m. do they notify the Los Angeles Police Department. The delay and the tightly controlled scene the first officers encounter will trouble some of them for the rest of their careers. The official record: Deputy Coroner Thomas Noguchi conducts the autopsy on August 5th. Toxicology tests show extremely high levels of two sedatives, Nembutal, pentobarbital, and chloral hydrate. The concentrations in her blood and liver are several times the accepted lethal dose. Empty bottles of both are found in her bedroom. A team of psychiatrists from the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center interviews Monroe's doctors and reviews her history of mood swings, prior overdoses, and recent emotional distress. On August 17th, Chief Coroner Theodore Curfey classifies the death as probable suicide, ruling out accident on the grounds that the massive dose must have been taken deliberately. For 20 years, that verdict stands. In 1982, amid growing public fascination and conspiracy books, Los Angeles District Attorney John Van de Kamp orders a full review. Investigators re-examine police files, autopsy materials, intelligence reports, and interview surviving witnesses. Their conclusion is cautious but clear. There is no credible evidence of homicide, and nothing that contradicts the original finding of probable suicide or accidental overdose. On the surface, the case aligns with a tragic but familiar pattern: a troubled celebrity, a history of self-harm, a lethal combination of drugs. But just beneath that surface, the file starts to fray. The medical anomalies. Even in 1962, not everyone at the scene is convinced. Sergeant Jack Clemens, the first LAPD officer to arrive, later says the body position looked staged. Monroe lying neatly on the bed, the phone still in her hand, the room strangely tidy for an overdose. He is uneasy about the 4-hour delay before police are called and about the rehearsed tone of the witnesses' answers. Those comments, made years after the fact, would help fuel suspicions that something had been arranged before officers arrived. The autopsy report also leaves questions. The barbiturate levels are unmistakably fatal, but according to later discussions of the case, Noguchi's findings included little or no evidence of undissolved capsules or pill residue in Monroe's stomach, something some critics argue should be present after such a massive dose. Complicating matters further, Noguchi would later write that not all the tissue samples he submitted for testing were actually analyzed. The head toxicologist, he claimed, decided that further testing was unnecessary once the blood and liver confirmed a lethal overdose. That decision left a permanent blind spot. Without full analysis of stomach contents and other organs, it is harder to reconstruct exactly how the drugs entered her system, swallowed, injected, or introduced by some other route. Noguchi has also been drawn into the controversy in another way. Decades later, he would reaffirm that on balance the evidence still pointed most strongly to suicide. Yet the incomplete testing he describes is a reminder that even a high-profile autopsy can hinge on choices and assumptions that later investigators can't undo. The file starts to look less like a clean report and more like a reel of film with crucial frames missing. The Kennedy question. Any discussion of Monroe's death veers quickly toward politics. By 1962, she has reportedly had an affair with President John F. Kennedy, and later a closer relationship with his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Biographers disagree over how long those affairs lasted and how serious they were, but even contemporary gossip columns link her to the Kennedy orbit. Some witnesses claim that in her final weeks, Monroe was angry and felt discarded, particularly by Robert Kennedy. Others insist she was still hopeful about new film projects and not suicidal. From these fragments, later authors construct a dramatic scenario. Monroe threatening to hold a press conference on August 6th, the Monday, after her death, to reveal her relationships with both brothers, and to talk about secrets she'd been told alleged plots against Fidel Castro mafia connections and classified political affairs. In this version of events, she becomes a liability. Powerful men, the argument goes, could not permit an emotionally unstable movie star to step in front of microphones with that kind of information. The 1982 District Attorney's Review examined these claims directly. Investigators combed FBI and CIA files, Secret Service reports, and White House telephone logs. They did find that federal agencies had kept routine files on Monroe, as they did on many politically connected celebrities in the Cold War era. But they found no operational plan targeting her and no credible evidence that either Kennedy was present the night she died. The Kennedy hypothesis remains compelling as a story, but the documentary trail that would elevate it from speculation to strong evidence has never surfaced. Mobsters, wiretaps, and the CIA. If not the Kennedys, then who? Another cluster of theories points toward organized crime and intelligence agencies. Monroe's social circle overlaps with that world in several ways. She spends time at the Calneva Lodge on Lake Tahoe, co-owned by entertainer Frank Sinatra and mob boss Sam Giancana, a figure tied to both the Kennedys and to CIA plots against Castro. Some accounts claim her Brentwood home was wired for sound by Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters, hoping to catch compromising material on Robert Kennedy, by federal agencies monitoring Hoffa himself, or by all of the above. In that telling, almost everyone around Marilyn is listening for leverage on someone else. The idea that Monroe's diary, allegedly containing notes about political conversations and Cuban plots, vanished after her death. Her telephone records disappeared. That men from the federal government removed files from the local phone company. These elements appear in multiple conspiracy narratives, but documentation is sparse and often second or third hand. The most detailed homicide scenario emerges from the work of British writer Matthew Smith and former Los Angeles prosecutor John Miner. They argue that Monroe was rendered unconscious with chloral hydrate and then given a massive dose of Nembutal dissolved in water and administered by enema, leaving no pill residue in the stomach and no needle marks on the body. Miner bases his views partly on transcripts he says he made of secret therapy tapes Monroe recorded with her analyst. In his memory, she sounded future-oriented, talking about new projects and personal goals, not like someone planning to die. He has never produced the original tapes, only his typewritten transcripts. Other writers go further, claiming that Monroe was killed with a syringe directly to the heart, delivering a lethal bolus of barbiturate that left no obvious injection mark. What these theories share is an attempt to solve the puzzle of the missing stomach residue and to reconcile the enormous drug levels with a method of administration that wouldn't leave obvious traces. What they lack is physical corroboration. No autopsy note describes damage to the rectal tissues or heart consistent with such procedures, and no surviving lab sample can be retested to look for telltale signs today. A botched autopsy and an enduring myth. As television documentaries and books revisit Monroe's death, the focus often shifts from what happened that night to what happened in the morgue and the archives afterward. By modern standards, the investigation was imperfect. Crime scene photographs are limited. Some original evidence, including portions of Monroe's organs preserved for further testing, was discarded after a period of years. When 48 Hours obtained the 1982 review materials, they found a mixture of careful interviews and unavoidable gaps. Witnesses who had died, records that had been routinely destroyed, memories colored by decades of rumor. The result is a file that can be read two ways. On one reading, the flaws are simply the limitations of 1960s forensic practice, a standard overdose investigation for what authorities believed was a straightforward suicide. On another, those same gaps become the space where homicide theories live, a suggestion that inconvenient evidence was ignored, mishandled, or quietly removed. Three competing narratives. The simplest explanation remains the one in the official record. Marilyn Monroe died by suicide after ingesting a large quantity of barbiturates by mouth. This reading fits her documented psychiatric history, her long-term dependence on sedatives, and the fatal drug levels in her blood and liver. It also aligns with the assessments of the coroner's office and the 1982 district attorney's review, which found no concrete evidence of external foul play. But the suicide hypothesis has to contend with the anomalies we have seen: incomplete testing, in the absence of clear pill residue, and a timeline that leaves room for debate. It doesn't fully address why her doctors delayed calling the police, or why some first responders felt the scene looked curated rather than chaotic. Those may be human errors and perceptions, not signs of homicide, but they stop the case from ever feeling fully settled. A second narrative frames her death as an accidental overdose. In this version, Monroe, long accustomed to sedatives, miscalculates a familiar dosage, possibly combining chloral hydrate prescribed for sleep with Nembutal in a way that overwhelms her system. The very high levels in her body could reflect both tolerance and a lack of caution on a night when she felt distressed, but not necessarily suicidal. The accident scenario softens the intent but runs into the same pharmacological wall. The dose appears to be many times the recommended therapeutic range, and the coroner's team at the time judged it unlikely to have been taken without awareness of the risk. The third narrative is murder. Here, Monroe is not simply a troubled individual, but a node in a network of politics, organized crime, and intelligence operations. She knows too much about the Kennedys, or she's seen too much at mob-connected gatherings, or she's become a bargaining chip in a struggle between the Attorney General and his enemies. Someone decides that the safest solution is to silence her in a way that can be framed as yet another celebrity overdose. This model uses the gaps in the record as connective tissue: the missing diary, the vanished tapes, the untested organs. It proposes alternative methods of administering the drugs, enemas, injections that fit some aspects of the autopsy and explain others away. Yet when we test this third narrative against the standards of strong evidence, documents, corroborated testimony, physical traces, it falters. The alleged therapy tapes have never been produced. No memo, orders, or hints at such an operation. No credible witness places a specific killer with her at the critical hours. The theories remain intricate stories built on suggestive details rather than on verifiable proof. What we're left with is a triangle of imperfect explanations, each solving part of the puzzle and leaving other pieces loose. What the file doesn't tell us. Marilyn Monroe's death file is not a neat dossier. It's a set of overlapping narratives, each written by a different era. The 1960s wrote it as the sad end of a fragile star. The 1970s and 80s rewrote it as a political thriller full of Kennedys, mobsters, and covert plots. Later decades layered on psychological readings, feminist critiques, and forensic re-examinations. The documents we have support a tragic overdose, probably self-inflicted, in a life where emotional pain and chemical escape were already entwined. They also reveal investigative gaps that would never pass modern scrutiny and that leave just enough space for darker possibilities. It's possible that her death was exactly what the record says, a final lethal dose taken alone in a small Los Angeles bedroom. It's also possible that in the confusion of that night, decisions were made about what to test, what to photograph, what to preserve, that accidentally erased the clarity we now look for. Between those poles lies the uncomfortable territory where this case still lives, not as a solved crime, not as a proven conspiracy, but as a reminder of how fragile truth can be when medicine, fame, and power collide. Because every mystery hides a truth. Whether Marilyn Monroe's is buried in missing tissue samples, lost tapes, or simply in the private pain no document can capture, that part of the file remains unresolved.